Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about the Vampire Coast, also known as one of the worst races in Total War Warhammer 3 for either Immortal Empires or the Old World mod, though they certainly can be better in Old World than they are in Immortal Empires, because the Old World is a slower paced campaign which does favor the Vampire Coast in certain ways. But let me make this very clear. The Vampire Coast, as it is in Warhammer 3, is a pretty bad race. In Warhammer 2, different situation, and I feel like there's a lot of people that played quite a bit of Warhammer 2 and have a perspective about which races are good, which races are bad, which races are well designed, which are not, and ignore the fact that Warhammer 3 is a very different game than Warhammer 2. Different meta, different balance, different campaign dynamics that you have to worry about. Warhammer 3 is very front heavy. The early portion of the campaign is what's really important. Warhammer 3 also has significant differences in balancing, AI cheats, etc. It's a very different campaign, and I wish people would stop treating it as if it's somehow similar. It is not. And so, I get to the Vampire Coast. Now, I do need to mention this before I get into the details of what makes them so terrible. I've played this game for over 2,000 hours, or about 2,000 hours or so. On Legendary exclusively, on Legendary difficulty. I've been playing on Legendary exclusively since it came out with Shogun 2. I've been playing Total War for over 15 years, getting closer to 20 years at this particular point. That is my experience with the game, and with the Vampire Coast in particular. Well, the first campaign that I won in Warhammer 3 was as the Vampire Coast. And when I say winning, typically speaking, what I consider a campaign win is when you get to a stage in your campaign where you are unbeatable. You can do so in about 20, 30, 40 turns. Depends on the race, depends on the Legendary Lords, depends on how well you do, but in about 40 turns you can do it. Roughly 10, 15, 20 hours. Depends on how many battles you have to fight manually. You can spend a lot of time of your campaign fighting battles. So that should put those 2,000 hours into perspective. Yes, I have over 100 individual campaigns, quite a bit more than that, because some campaigns are very short until you get to that position where you've won, where losing would mean screwing up in a significant fashion. It wouldn't even be funny, or it would be a deliberate screw up by the player. But for the Vampire Coast, I didn't just go for that. No, I went for a full campaign victory, a long campaign victory, along with dealing with the Tomb King's Endgame Crisis. That is my experience with the Vampire Coast. That's my experience with Warhammer 3. Because inevitably, there's always going to be people that are going to type, oh, you just don't know how to play. No, I know how to play them. I can win this game as every race, as any Legendary Lord, even Daniel. It's just awful to play certain characters, certain races. And the Vampire Coast certainly is one of those races. One of the things that makes them awful, to be very clear from the beginning, is the fact that you may end up having to fight far more manual battles and thus prolong your campaign far more so than it should. You may have to fight far more manual battles than the vast majority of races in the game, because the Vampire Coast does very poorly on auto-resolve. They have one of the worst auto-resolve results in the entire game. The reason behind that is auto-resolve cares a great deal about armor, and you have a bunch of units with low armor. I also think it cares a lot about leadership from my experience, and the Vampire Coast also has poor leadership in its units. That is the dilemma the Vampire Coast do have. Like, even if they were much more powerful, they'd still be pretty damn terrible to play because of the auto-resolve situation. But that's not it, really. It's not just auto-resolve. That's a detail that can be really frustrating, but that's not what makes the Vampire Coast bad, because the Skaven also have a poor auto-resolve, and they're one of the most powerful races in the entire game. So what makes the Vampire Coast so atrocious to play in any campaign? It doesn't matter if it's Noctilus, it doesn't matter if it's Aranessa, it doesn't matter if it's Illustra. They're all awful to play one way or another. Well, first off, let's talk about the unit roster. Actually, I'll use the settlement buildings to reflect on this. So early on in your campaign, your units, which aren't necessarily the cheapest units to recruit and maintain in the world, because you look at upkeep, it's over 100. That is more expensive than some other races. But your units that you recruit from early on in your campaign, with exception of the artillery, so mortars and carronades, a lot of these units are just going to collapse very quickly in any particular battle. They don't have great melee stats. They don't have great armor. Any ranged faction will obliterate them, and their melee capability is laughable. Oh, sure, they have a good amount of HP, a lot of HP to absorb all the damage that they will inevitably take. Absolutely, but they just don't have a lot of power in combat. They can do better against melee factions, but against range-centric factions, including the High Elves, which is particularly relevant for Noctilus if you did decide to stick around Ulthuan, or Silostra, who's sandwiched between Ulthuan and the Dark Elves, yeah, that low level of armor is going to really end up hurting them in a significant fashion. There are some good units in this roster, and a lot of people would say, oh, Necrofex are powerful. They're not. For the cost they have, and even as Noctilus, who can significantly lower their upkeep and get a bunch of benefits, Necrofex are really strong in terms of their damage, or decently strong in terms of their damage, though I found myself disappointed by their missile strength, to be honest. Necrofex are decently powerful, but they're also squishy. Put the Rogue Idol against the Necrofex, just as an example, as a big, expensive unit, or many other units. Though, to be honest, I think like the giant monstrous units in Warhammer 3 in particular, we can talk about Elemental Bears, we can talk about Rogue Idols. They're very expensive, and you're just better off in Warhammer 3 getting as many armies with as much power as possible in those armies. That's the meta of Warhammer 3, and this is the problem of the Vampire Coast. A lot of their cheap units are bad, a lot of their higher tier units can be decent, if not powerful. Depth Guard, for instance, are actually a pretty powerful melee unit, though they may not have the armor of, say, Chosen, and they will lose against Chosen in direct combat. But Depth Guard certainly have the power, but they are 325 upkeep, and they require Tier 4 and Tier 5. By the way, it should be pointed out that Aranessa can get Ogres if you own the Ogre Kingdoms DLC, and Man-Eaters at Tier 3, that's certainly a decent amount of power. Sure, they're also expensive, ridiculously so, but just the fact that you have them available earlier on in the campaign, well, you won't be massing armies of either Ogres or Depth Guard, but they can help complement your other unit roster. This is the reason Aranessa works so well, because she can get a bunch of Sartosa companies, put a bunch of Ogres there in those Sartosa companies, and get a good amount of power from that, combined with artillery. But it's exclusive to Aranessa. Outside of that, the unit roster just isn't really that great in a lot of ways, and the parts of it that are good, the units that are worth recruiting, are very expensive, which is a problem because the economy of the Vampire Coast is, well, pretty awful would be underselling it. Your provincial capital building can go, or your income building from provincial capital can cost all the way up to 4,000 and only generate 300 income. That is horrible. In minor settlements, you go up to Tier 3 and generates 200 income for 1,500. Mind you, in provincial capital, you do get an additional effect for these buildings because you can generate Curse of the Bountiful Treasure right to get more money, but money is a problem in a Vampire Coast campaign. The buildings that generate the most money are actually the ports, but that also is a problem in a Vampire Coast campaign, because while having a lot of ports might seem logical, reasonable, and sensical in a Vampire Coast campaign, there's a reason why you may not do so. Now, the trick when it comes to economy is that this is all balanced around the idea that you can get an upkeep benefit, looking at it, of up to 20% for the Horde armies that you do have, because you do have a couple of Horde armies, so up to 20% from the main building, and an additional 15%, so minus 35% upkeep reduction. That's good until you realize that you can only have 5 of these armies in total in your campaign, and you require a lot of infamy to get the other 4 beyond the Legendary Lord. So you start with the Legendary Lord, they'll have a fleet attached to them, the Horde army, you can get 4 more. Now, an army of the Vampire Coast without a Horde army is dead in the water. Horde armies do give a lot of power, campaign movement range, upkeep, casualty replenishment, and unit experience. There's some really sweet benefits over here, missile strength, etc. There's a good amount of power with this, but you are going to end up playing a limited campaign with limited armies, which doesn't work well within the meta of Warhammer 3. There's very few races where it can work very well. For instance, Wood Elves can do it, because yes, Wood Elves will have limited armies, though they don't have any specific limitations, but you're just not going to be running around with like a dozen stacks as the Wood Elves, unless you're playing Orion, who absolutely can and will do so. But Wood Elves, Beastmen to an extent, though their early game is pretty awful, but once they start steamrolling, it becomes powerful. Tomb Kings, some issues that I've talked about in other videos, but absolutely Tomb Kings can do it. But the factions that are typically the most powerful are factions that can maintain a bunch of armies relatively cheaply on the campaign map and have a powerful economy to back it up. It doesn't have to be an economy based purely on either trading or settlement buildings. Greenskins, for instance, rely far more heavily on sacking and looting settlements than many other races because they can't trade, and they can earn a biblical amount of money in their campaign. The Vampire Coast can earn a good amount of money from sacking and looting settlements, except it's just not good enough for them. The reason it's not good enough has to do with some of the campaign dynamics that I have to talk about. One of the principal strengths that the Vampire Coast does have is their lords and heroes. Now, when we're talking about lords, when you're looking at leveling up a lord, what do you want to level up in that lord? Because the Vampire Coast does have powerful magic, but you're going to have to make a choice with respect to that powerful magic. So you've got Lore of Vampires, Lore of the Deep, Lore of Death. Deep and Vampires are pretty powerful magic lines. But here's the problem that you're going to have to tackle here. You've got a huge amount of skills to choose from, and while it sounds great to go for the magic tree on the lords, in reality, you're going to want to get some of the blue skill line, like campaign movement range. You're going to want to at least get inspiring presence, even if your army is utter trash. Your artillery is one of your few strengths in terms of army rosters that you can get early on. So you likely want to get black powder overload to get ammunition, not the strength, but ammunition for these. And then, really, you will want to get the melee skill line as opposed to the magic skill line because the melee power on a bunch of lords is more significant than them having magic. Now, I mention this because the other way of getting magic are Vampire Fleet Captains, Morgan Hunters, and Gunnery Whites. There are a couple of ways of increasing capacity. The problem for the Vampire Coast is the Vampire Coast cannot typically do so through settlements. They can get a Vampire Fleet Captain hero capacity +1 at tier 5. If you get the provincial capital, that's also a port. And that's about it. You cannot increase Gunnery White or Morgan Hunters. By the way, the Morgan Hunters are incredibly powerful heroes. Probably some of the best heroes that you can have in a campaign. And obviously the Vampire Fleet Captains with their magical ability are also powerful. Other ways you can increase hero capacity goes as follows. Like if we're looking at the fleets, you can get 1 per fleet, per horde army, so you can get 1, so you're going to get up to 5. If you get all 5, you won't do so very quickly. And you can get up to 5 Gunnery Whites from the fleets themselves. And also a Vampire Fleet Captain as well. So, in total, by default in your campaign, you can get up to 5 hero capacity. Obviously, you do start 1, so 6 heroes from the fleets. If you unlock them, that's a longer game proposition. You can genuinely finish a long campaign and get maybe 2 free fleets, even if you're going after it deliberately, to be clear on that. So you won't be running around with that 6 hero capacity in total. The 5 you get through the horde armies, the 1 you get by the one you start with by default. So you have a limitation on heroes that genuinely hurts because your army is awful, your heroes are the way you make up for it, but you can't increase that by as much. Now, there is a way around this. That way involves getting Pirates' Rests and getting the hero capacity for Mongol Hunters and Gunnery Whites through that. The problem with Pirate Coves is, well, several problems. One, you may want to raise settlements, and if you raise a settlement, then you have to rebuild it. But if you take it over, if you're raising it, well, good luck setting up a Pirate Cove. The dynamic of having to attack ports, which are the main way you can earn money in a campaign, and not take them over, because instead you want to increase your hero capacity for the power they give you, is a pretty awful dynamic. It means that you end up losing power, especially early on in a campaign, because you have to choose. Do I take a port for the income it gives me, or do I put the Pirate Cove in a port to increase the hero capacity? That is the fundamental choice the Vampire Coast has to make in their campaign. And that is one of the things that breaks them. Because one, you're leaving factions alive. And if another faction that you might be allied with, like my Noctiluss campaign for a long time, I was allied with Tyrion, and he took those settlements. But if they raise them, if they abandon them, if something happens, good luck, you're not going to have a Pirate Cove. That is the problem. Which, by the way, for all the things I can say badly about the Changeling, CA realized that this was a bad idea for a campaign reliant on settlements, and so they made that change for the Changeling. The Changeling does not have this issue. I feel like if the Vampire Coast could have a Pirate Cove, even in settlements they control, like a secondary building that you had to make a choice, that would be a good amount of power. Like if you could take the ports, increase hero capacity for your Vampire fleet captains, especially provincial capitals. If you could take the ports, set up Pirate Coves at the same time, make those buildings, the Vampire Coast would not have the same issues. But why, you might ask, why wasn't this a problem in Warhammer 2? The reason this wasn't a problem in Warhammer 2 is because in Warhammer 2, Warhammer 2's meta was designed around having few armies that each had as much power. With the exception of a couple of races and very long campaign, you're not going to maintain a dozen armies from very early on in your campaign. In Warhammer 3, you can get 6+ armies, Dark Elves, Greenskins, Skaven, you can get a lot of armies very quickly. And I don't care how powerful each individual army is, 6 armies of Skaven bearing down on you is something that you're going to have to deal with. So it was a difference of supply lines, really. The supply lines were significantly reduced in Warhammer 3 versus Warhammer 2. That brought about a significant change to the meta, to the way the game is played, and one makes a race powerful, one makes a race weak. The most powerful races, for the most part, are races that embrace this concept. Or there are races like the Warriors of Chaos and Wood Elves. But here's the thing about Warriors of Chaos and Wood Elves, the reason they work, even though they have limited armies. The reason Warriors of Chaos works is, and Wood Elves work, is they have 2 of the most powerful freaking army rosters in the entire game. The range power and melee power of the Wood Elves, the artillery power, yes, Hellcannons are powerful, the artillery power and sheer melee madness that the Warriors of Chaos have. Also, Warriors of Chaos can get a lot of heroes in their campaigns. And Warriors of Chaos do get a significant amount of income for their vassals and their dark fortresses. So you actually end up with more armies than the Vampire Coast can actually muster. You having a lot of movement range and getting a lot of income from sacking settlements sounds great, but do you know how you gain a lot of income from sacking settlements? Having a lot of armies, sacking multiple settlements per turn. You just fall far short compared to other races, and you're going to be playing catch-up for a very long time, and you're never going to be able to catch up to some of those races. So anyone telling me that the Vampire Coast is a powerful race, I'm like, in what universe is that joke true? Because it is a joke to argue that. Greenskins, Skaven, Dark Elves, High Elves, they're far more powerful. Yes, I'm going to go with that. Warriors of Chaos, Wood Elves, enormously more powerful. At best, even at their very, very best, Vampire Coast, ignoring the major issues that come with the crappy army roster, at best, it's a mediocre race. When you combine that with the army roster, yeah, it's dog tier. When you combine that with the fact that hero capacity is an annoyance and the nuisance of having to choose between raising a settlement for infamy, which you may want to do because infamy can give you significant power, raising a settlement for infamy, sacking a settlement for more money, or setting up a Pirate Cove if you're dealing coastal settlements, it doesn't come even close. Like, they're an F-tier race by far. They're an F-tier of an F-tier. The only races that I consider worse than Vampire Coast are Daniel, yes, Yuri, Kugath, and Kairos to some extent. And also, I just want to point this out. Kairos' army beats the crap out of the Vampire Coast army, and it's not even funny in that respect. Like, Kairos is screwed over because of the casualty replenishment and poor economy he has. Vampire Coast has a poor economy, poor army. The only units they have that are powerful are too expensive for them to maintain in large numbers, and so you end up limited. You're just a limited race. They were designed to be a limited race, and we're seeing the impact of that in Warhammer 3. It affects races like the Tomb Kings, which have significantly more power in their campaigns than anything the Vampire Coast can even dream of. Yeah, I'll take Doom stacks of free units in a Tomb King campaign past turn 40 with free armies with lords that cannot be killed without having to deal with loyalty over this garbage. And it is garbage. The fact that people want to pretend the Vampire Coast is any good, I'm like, No. The best campaign you can play is Aranessa, and I say this as someone who's beaten Noctilus's campaign on Legendary, dealt with the Wolf 1. I say this, the only reason Aranessa's campaign is better, one, she gets a sacking benefit to begin with. She has a better starting position. She doesn't have to deal with freaking elves. And free, she gets units that help her out early on, be it Sartosa Free Company or Ogres. That you can get a couple of those to really help your melee combat power. And eventually, yeah, you can get things like Depth Guard and all that. Also, because she has a lot of ports that should start in her nearby area that she can gain access from, be it Tylea, Rapans, or Archon's starting positions. Yeah, there's a lot of ports that Aranessa can get. The problem is she still has this issue, the limitation of hero capacity that she's going to have to struggle with, and the bigger limitations of economy that the Vampire Coast has to deal with. That's where I stand on the Vampire Coast. As someone who has played them, as someone who's played this series for a long time, someone who's played Total War for a long time. Now, if the Warhammer Free campaign meta was different, more limited, slower paced, absolutely. But even then, even with the old world being slower paced, they're still not great as a race. Because all it would take to screw your entire campaign over is someone raising this element, for instance. As an example, that could genuinely screw you over. And having to rely on ports for your economy is finicky at best. The reason it's finicky at best is because they may not march a significant distance through land to attack you, but they can and will travel by sea for a significant distance to raise one of your ports. And having limited armies, having limitations on how many armies you can have in a campaign, is a problem from that perspective as well, because it means you are less active on you're active on fewer fronts than other races can be. You can make it work. Here's the key to making it work, just to understand how you do it. You rely on mass artillery early on in campaign. Like over here, I haven't gotten any artillery because she does start with that tier 1 army, but you get a bunch of mortars. Then you get a couple of carronades. You get a bunch of mortars, a couple of melee units. If you're Aranessa, you get Sartosa Free Company. As everyone else, you get whatever you want. It doesn't matter. The army is irrelevant. You just want to have the numbers for a balance of power. And you don't, like, you might fight sieges where your army is doing nothing, because if you send them in the settlement, they'll just get obliterated. Funnily enough, the Vampire Coast is one of the few damn races in the game where they actually are awful at attacking a settlement, where the vast majority of factions in the game is better to be the attacker and defender. Mind you, they're pretty bad at defending settlements as well, because a lot of their units have gunpowder, and gunpowder range units suck pretty hard right now in Warhammer Free. That's also another issue. You're supposed to have this range firepower. You don't, because of the way gunpowder units work in Warhammer Free versus Warhammer 2 and Warhammer 1. There is a huge difference in the way gunpowder units work. A change Creative Assembly has made, and a change in the meta. Like, the way magic works, the power of magic, the power of range units. Like, spells in Warhammer 2 can obliterate armies. Spells in Warhammer 3, they're more subdued in that respect. It was deliberate. CA made that deliberate change. I think it was when we saw the pendulum from Kairos. Like, we started seeing the pendulum ability. Not from Kairos, but we saw the pendulum in Warhammer 3 initially, and it was like, that was ridiculous. Just absolutely broken. And Creative Assembly has toned it down, has toned down ranged firepower by a lot, have screwed over gunpowder units in general. Another problem that does affect the Vampire Coast more so than others. But here's the key. You get as many heroes as you can, you get as much artillery as you can, you get as many horde armies as you can as quickly as you can, and then you make alliances with various races. Typically not the order races, because they don't particularly like you in a lot of ways, for good reason I might add. But you can certainly make it work, like the -10 version that, for instance, I have over here with the quote-unquote the Southern Realms. It can be done. Some races do hate you, but typically you might be facing a -40 version. So you get an alliance, you sack settlements, you rely on sacking settlements, you set up Pirate Coves, you take some ports, but you rely on taking settlements, selling it to your ally, making money through that. And you rely on the ally to ultimately take the settlements where you set up Pirate Coves, occupy them, hopefully without raising them. That is the key to a Vampire Coast campaign. It's still freaking awful, because, again, less armies, relying on vassals and diplomacy, while it can work and can work brilliantly, I have to emphasize, Warriors of Chaos who have a lot of vassals, who can play Masters of Diplomacy in more ways than you might think, Warriors of Chaos do not need their allies to do the heavy lifting for them. Warriors of Chaos abuse their vassals and allies to win campaigns faster, but they do not need them at all. You could play an entire Warriors of Chaos campaign without any vassals and you'd still obliterate everyone in your path. So yes, the power of diplomacy certainly does exist. Just trading settlements, taking settlements, trading them over, or being at war with a mutual faction, hoping your ally will take their settlements and make them their own. That's something that can work. I've done it. That was the key to my Noctilus campaign. I allied Tyrion and then they end up lasting, but that was the key. Other people rush Lothern and, I don't know, ally Nakari and Morathi, I suppose. Those are some of the options you do have available. But you're reliant on it far more so than other factions. And also, like, even if you had the ability, even if you had more diplomatic options like subjugation, for instance, you'd still not be in a great position compared to those other races. Like, Nakari, for instance, can subjugate factions, right? Nakari still has a ton of issues, for instance. It's just like Nakari can vassalize Tyrion, Alarion, and Elfarion. Yeah, that's a bit different than what anything that the Vampire Coast can do in their campaigns. That's all I had to say. Quistine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.